Similarities and Differences Between French and British Slave Laws by Ariana Morrison and Janelle Norman. Similarity, oh. Similarities between French and British slave laws. Any slave that has either strike or violently abused any white person will be punished by death, hard labor for life, or otherwise the court in their discretion. To provide ground provision that is proper and sufficient quality of land for slaves in, in provide labor for the plantation. Masters were not to discard slaves for their used for hard labor, which provide their services. Slaves were to be provided with sufficient clothing each year. Masters weren't allowed to kill their slaves. No slaves were allowed to work on the plantation before 5 in the morning and after 6 in the night. You can change it, Janelle. Differences between French and British slave laws. The differences. British saw the enslaved that they were deemed as property, while French deemed enslaved as subordinate persons. The British had no official slave laws, and the French had Code Noir, which was promulgated in the 17th century. The British laws were created by individual islands' legislatives, while the French laws were transferred to all islands. Can change it, Janelle? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that one. You're through?
Yes, sir.
Good, good. That was a good one. Good presentation. You answered the question.
Thank you,
Where?
sir.
Yeah, man. Group 9, Robinson and Sawyers. Robinson is here. Okay, good, good.
Okay, sir, can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today, Anna Alicia Robinson and Shania Flores will be presenting on the similarities and differences between British and Spanish slave law. Firstly, what are slave laws? Slave codes or laws were laws created during chattel slavery in the Americas to enforce social and economic control over enslaved Africans and Amerindians. So the first similarity between the British and Spanish slave laws were movement restrictions. Some regions required any slave away from their plantation or outside of cities they resided in to have a pass which was a slave tag or badge signed by their master as proof of approval from their master. Two, education laws. Most, if not all, territories had a law that made it illegal to educate slaves or teach them how to read and write. Three, slave patrol laws. Across the Americas, there were varying degrees of legal authority supported by slave patrols by plantation owners to enforce movement restrictions on the enslaved. Gathering laws. All across the Western Hemisphere, laws were put in place to prevent large groups of enslaved people from gathering on and off their plantations. Religion. Throughout the entire New World, the enslavers were committed to converting the enslaved Africans to Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism, and prohibited the practice of any other religion. Slave trade and commerce. Initially, most places gave enslaved some land to work and allowed them to operate business. But as slavery became more profitable, slave laws were created which restricted the rights to sell and produce goods. Later, it was modified to allow special enslaved people to own businesses. And the differences between the British and Spanish slave laws. One, the Spanish slave laws and codes acknowledged that slavery was contrary to natural justice and evil, was a necessary evil for the economic development of their colonies. This was primarily due to the fact that the church had a big impact on their judicial system. Two, in British territories, slavery was not a condition recognized under English law, and there was little to no opposition in England before the 1780s. Three, Spanish territories allowed slaves to appeal to the court against ill treatment from their masters. British territories did not do so. Four, Spanish enslaved had the right to marriage, but only to their own race, without the consent of their owners, while in British territories they weren't allowed to get married. Five, Spanish codes required all judges to promote liberty because liberty was natural. In Spanish possessions, consequently, the slaves could find the court on their side. This could never be the case in British Islands. Six, in British territories, slave masters could punish and kill any slave at any time, and they were allowed to treat their slaves in the way they saw fit. However, in Spanish territories, masters could not kill or punish his slave to the point of suffering, nor could he overwork or underfeed his slave. Thank you all for listening. That was the end of our presentation.
All right, thank you very much. Very good attempt, very good attempt. Next. Group 10, Sterling and Taylor.
Similarities or differences between the British and Spanish slave laws. Similarities between Spanish and English slave laws. There are many similarities between the various slave codes. The most common elements are movement restrictions. Most regions required any slaves away from their plantations or outside of the cities they resided in to have a pass signed by their master. Many cities in the slave states required slave tags, small copper badges that enslaved people wore to show that they were allowed to move about. Marriage restrictions. Most places restricted the marriage rights of enslaved people, ostensibly to prevent them from trying to change masters by marrying into a family on another plantation. Marriage between people of different races was also usually restricted. Prohibition on gathering. Slave codes generally prevented large groups of enslaved people from gathering away from their plantations. Can you go to the next slide, please? Slave patrols. In the slave-dependent portions of North America, Varying degrees of legal authority backed slave patrols by plantation owners and other free whites to ensure that enslaved people were not free to move about at night and to generally enforce the restrictions on slaves. Trade and commerce by slaves. Initially, most places gave enslaved people some land to work personally and allowed them to operate their markets. As slavery became more profitable, slave codes restricting the rights of enslaved people to buy, sell, and produce goods were introduced. In some places, slave tags were required to be worn by enslaved people to prove that they were allowed to participate in certain types of work. Punishment and killing of slaves. Slave codes regulated how slaves could be punished, usually going so far as to apply no penalty for accidentally killing a slave while punishing them. Later laws began to apply restrictions on this, but slave owners were still rarely punished for killing their slaves. Historian Lawrence M. Friedman wrote, 10 Southern codes made it a crime to mistreat a slave. Under the Louisiana Civil Code of 1825, if a master was convicted of cruel treatment, the judge could order the sale of the mistreated slave, presumably to a better master. Education restrictions. Some codes made it illegal to teach slaves to read. Differences between the British and Spanish slave laws. The Siete Partidas was more lenient towards slaves and gave them the more of an advantage, while the slaves under the British rule and laws. By the mid-18th century, Jamaica had become the largest and most brutal slave society in the British West Indies. Slaves were supervised under demanding masters who gave them little medical care and so contracted many diseases. Slave laws in the British Empire developed slowly over centuries, characterized by indecision and varying rationales on the treatment of slaves. Until 1807, there was no legislative intervention in relation to slavery. Therefore, the common law was freely developed. The English had laws giving equality and fair treatment to its citizens, while the Spanish slave laws was a Castilian statutory code, which established a body of normative rules for the kingdom, originally called Libro de las Leyes, which not until the 14th century was called Siete Partidas, and its influence extended to the Latin American colonies. There was no central English slave code. Each colony developed its own code while in the practice. The slave codes of the Spanish colonies were local laws, similar to those in other regions. There was an overarching legal code, Las Siete Partidas, which granted many specific rights to the slaves in these regions. But there is little record of it actually being used to benefit the slaves in the Americas.
Thank you very much. Thompson, Walker. Thompson is here, Pavel. And Davis is here. Davis Christian. All right, ladies, thank you very, very much for those of you in out of 11 group. 9 groups would have presented, and the presentations were good overall, good presentation. But what I want you to do is to, I'm coming up right now. I'm coming up. I want you to create a table like this, where you're going to put British, Spanish, and French slave laws. And then you're going to complete the table. All right? So that is part of the work that I want you to do.
Sir, when is this due?
No, that is not something that is due. I'm not collecting it. That is something that you will have to do. I'm not collecting it. I'm not going to mark this. All the groups would have presented on the different slave laws. And so what you're going to do is that you're going to put British, Spanish, and French. I'm not collecting this work. It is imperative upon you to do it. So I'm encouraging you to do it. Because it's a requirement for the exam that you know the examples of the British, examples of the French and the Spanish slave laws. And also to know the similarities and differences. And on that note, let us look at some of the requirements, why slave laws were used. Somebody, could you read the first point for me, please? Slave laws. Reader, please.
The slave laws enacted by the island's legislators in the 17th century tell us a good deal about the treatment of Negroes and the character of slavery.
Thank you very much, Brown. So if we look at the slave laws in the British colony, the French colony, and the Spanish colonies, so we know the Spanish, the British slave law had any special name attached to it? Yes or no?
No.
Good. What was the name of the French slave law?
Code Noir.
Very good. And what was the name of the Spanish? What was the name of the Spanish?
Partidas.
Very good. Siete partidas. Very good. So if we should look at the code now, the siete partidas are the several different British slave laws, because every single British colony had their own slave law. So if you live in Barbados, you have the Barbados British slave law. If you lived in Jamaica, you have in fact, it is British Barbados slave law. If you lived in Jamaica, it was the British Jamaica slave law. If you live in St. Kitts, it was the British St. Kitts slave law. So anywhere the British lived, anywhere the British settled and had enslaved people, they had their own slave laws. But if you're in Cuba, which laws Cubans would practice?
Spanish.
Yes, what is the name? Very good. If you are in Haiti, what was the law, the slave law there?
Code Noir.
Very good. If you are in Martinique.
Code Noir.
Code Noir.
Guadeloupe.
Code Noir.
Very good, very good. If you were in Colombia.
Siete
partidas.
Very good, very good. So if we look at all of these territories, it tells us, if you look at the slave laws, it tells us how enslaved people were actually treated and the character of slavery. Now, another point, may I have a volunteer? Bianca is here? Or Gabriel?
Sir.
Bianca?
Yes, sir.
The second point for me, please.
All aspects of a slave's life, conduct, and the work came under official scrutiny. Alvin Thompson.
Thank you very much, James. So if we look at the slave laws, we see that every single aspect of the enslaved people's life came under scrutiny. You have studied the slave laws. What are some of the enslaved people lives that came under scrutiny in terms of their life, their conduct, and their work? What came under scrutiny? Tell me. Recap. What the slave laws tell us about how the life operates, how the work operates in terms of their conduct, what is expected. Come, ladies,
They
you did the
couldn't strike their
presentation.
master.
Repeat, Norman.
They couldn't strike their master, or they would be like punished to death.
Very
Or
good. So the first one is that they couldn't strike their master or they would be punished to death. So that tells you prescription about their conduct, what is expected. Perfect. Continue again from it, Norman. Which other one?
they were allotted or given land, and they were expected to work on the plantation since they were provided with clothing, food, and the basic necessities.
So on some territories, they were given land. What they usually call that land?
Sir, provision grounds.
The provision grounds. Very good. So at the periphery of the plantation, the back part, they usually get that land to plant their own food, right? What other aspect of their life came under scrutiny? Their life and their work.
So they were allowed to work um after 5 in the morning and
Yes.
and to 6 in the night.
5, yes. So that was it. And then what about in terms of, because it's not only the work hours that came under scrutiny, but they also were allotted time for what in the day?
Sir, lunch, meals.
Meals. So they got the breakfast and their lunch, or they call it dinner. Very good. So we know for sure that all aspects of their lives came under scrutiny. And it also, the law legalized and justified slavery. Now, notice this, because next September when we return, this is a point where we're going to start from. The law legalized, meaning that the law made slavery acceptable in the society. Somebody, could you read this point from me, please?
The law legalized and
Yes.
justified enslavement. West Indian historian Elsa Galova stated, slave law justified the system of slavery. The law is the original basis of slavery in the West Indian colonies. Those slave laws were essential for the continued existence of slavery as an institution. Slavery is undoubtedly accepted as legal.
Very good. So slave laws, thank you very much, Norman. Slave laws gave the society a reason to say who is free from who is not free, who is enslaved from who should not be enslaved. It justified slavery. Also, as we mentioned up here, it stipulated conduct. And if you don't follow those conducts or rules, then you are punished. It tells you the different types of punishments that the enslaved people would get if they don't follow the rules, right? And therefore, let I go to here. If we look at the different slave laws and how they were created, promulgated meaning how they were created, In Britain, they had no slave laws, and therefore the individual legislators passed the laws. But in Spanish territories, the laws were transferred from Spain to the Caribbean, or anywhere in the world that Spanish had slaves, they used the Siete Partidas. And in fact, the Siete Partidas was originally used when the Spanish had problems with the Moors and the Jews in Spain. All right. Then the French slave laws were also transferred to the Caribbean. So anywhere French people settled and had enslaved people, the rule that they used was Code Noir. And in somebody's presentation, I see that they mention about Louisiana, because Louisiana and the United States, which is now the part of the United States, was actually part of France. It was a colony of France back in the days. And so Louisiana would have used the Code Noir also. So that is a perfect example. Where am I? Now, also within the colonies, that we need another thing about the slave laws is that in the British, so let us see if I can help. In the British, enslaved people were considered property, while in the Spanish, they were considered subordinate person, and also in the French, they were considered subordinate person. All right. So this is how they were classified in the Spanish and in the French territories, right, as subordinate persons. Now, in the Spanish territories, if we look at the Spanish slave laws, in the Spanish slave laws, these are some examples in the Spanish slave laws. Somebody recap the things in the Siete Partidas. Read it from me, please.
A slave could appeal to the courts against ill treatment. A slave could purchase his or her freedom without the consent of his owner. All he or she had to do was to pay the master the equivalent of what the master had bought him or her for. He or she could get married without the consent of his or her owner. The slaves were not to work on holy days. The master was obligated to teach the slaves the Roman Catholic faith. Specific days must be set aside for this. The master could not kill his slave or ill-treat him to the point of suffering. The master could not overwork or underfeed his slaves. The master had to provide clothing, food, and care for his elderly slaves.
Thank you very much. Now, so this is this Spanish slave laws. We're doing so in the Spanish slave laws, one of the first thing that they mentioned was that the last point is that the planters were supposed to provide clothing in terms of food and shelter for the enslaved person. So one, planters provide food, clothing, shelter for enslaved. Was that the same in the French? Was that the same for the Code Noir?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Was that the same for the British?
Yes, sir.
Very good. All right. What else, ladies? So the provide is one. So we know for sure that this is a similarity. This is a similarity between the British, the Spanish, and the French. The planters were supposed to provide for them. Now, what about the whole issue of marriage? We just read here that the masters, where it is, he or she could get married without the consent of his or her owner. Let us see the code now. Because if you read right here for the code now, it said slave who are not fed, clothes, and whatever, that we could look at it. It's not mentioned here. So we know for sure, ladies, that in the Spanish territory, enslaved persons could get married. Was that the same for the French? Ladies, was that the same for the French? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, so that was the same. Was that the same for the British?
No, sir.
Good. Another one was that they could purchase their freedom under the Spanish slave law. The stated party, they say, you could purchase your freedom without the master's consent. Was that the case for the Spanish? Well, that is the Spanish one. Purchase freedom. What we call, when you purchase a freedom, what is the word we use?
Manumission.
Manumission.
Very good. So you could purchase your freedom, your manumission, with or without the master's consent. Was that the same for the French? Could you purchase your freedom in the French territory under the Code Nord? Who did the French slave laws? Ladies, were they able to purchase their freedom? Hello?
Yes, sir.
So they were able to purchase their freedom. But what about the British? Were they able to purchase their freedom?
No, sir.
No. Anybody disagree with that?
Yes, sir.
But what is the difference between the Spanish and the French? So everybody are able to purchase their freedom, but there's something that is important. The last part here, What
So
is
you,
it?
so you had to purchase freedom with the master's permission?
Very good. Very good. Was the British concerned about overwork? The British concerned about the enslaved being overworked?
No, sir.
No, sir.
So no consideration. But what about the Spanish? The Spanish say that you could not. You could not.
Overrate them?
You could not overwork them. Same thing for the.
French.
Very good. What about separation of families? Who encouraged family life? That you could not separate families.
The Spanish.
So, under the Spanish, the same thing for the French, correct?
Yes, sir.
What about the British?
No,
What
sir.
about the British?
No, sir.
So, and so you could separate families. What else, ladies? What about religious teachings?
The British banned religious purposes from the African culture.
So they both banned African. So these one banned African culture. Good. Was that the same for the Spanish? Was that the same for the Spanish?
Sir, I'm not sure, but I know that the Spanish encouraged the slaves to become Roman Catholics.
All right, so they encourage them to be Roman Catholic. The French also encourage them to be Roman Catholic. Hmm?
Yes,
The French
sir.
also.
But
Let us read this part of the slave law here for the Spanish, where it is. No, the French. What they said here for the French slave law, somebody read this for me. This point.
Any slave who shall pretend to any supernatural power in order to affect the health or lives of others or promote the purposes of rebellion shall upon conviction thereof suffer death or such other punishment as the court shall think proper or direct.
What is that saying about the French slave law in terms of African culture?
The bandit?
They banned it. Very good. Everybody afraid of African culture. When you hear the word supernatural power, what do you think that they're talking about?
Gods.
Obia
Okay.
witchcraft.
Huh?
Like
Obia?
Obia witchcraft.
Obia, they're talking about, yes, they're afraid. They're afraid people obey them. That was the reason. So not only the Spanish, the British banned African culture, but also the Spanish and also the French. Now let us look about the Christianity part of it when it comes to the Christianity part of it for let us read what the Spanish said right here, the British. And this is a perfect example from Jamaica. Somebody read this part for me, please.
That all masters and mistresses, owners, or in their absence, overseers of slaves, shall as much as in them lies, endeavor the instruction of their slaves in the principle of the Christian religion, whereby to facilitate their conversion, and shall be their utmost.
So this is from the Jamaica slave law, right? Were they also encouraged? So we know for sure that the slave law said in Spanish territories that they must be encouraged them to convert to Christianity. In fact, same thing for Roman Catholicism, same thing for French, but also it was the same for the British, correct? Correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
A part of the slave law also said in the Spanish territories that enslaved persons could bring the master to court or the planter. They could bring the planter, master, to court without his consent. Was that the same for the French? Was that the same for the French? Somebody read this part for me, please.
Slaves were not fed, clothed, and maintained by their masters, as we have ordained, may report the fact to our Procurator General, their complaints in his hand. In each case, or if the information comes from others, the masters shall be summoned at their request but without cause, which will be the same process as we would wish pursued for crimes barbarous and by masters against their slaves.
Very good. So under the French slave laws, if you weren't treated properly, you could go to somebody that was called a procurator general and you could make a complaint, right? But under the Spanish, somebody read this part for me under the Spanish. There it is. Read this one.
A slave could a slave could a slave could appeal to the courts against ill treatment.
Very good. So both of them had to, so the Spanish, you could go to the court. The French had a procurator general, but what about the British? You could go to the court?
No, sir.
No court. And they had no procurator general. What about killing a white person in the Spanish? What was the punishment?
To be punished by death or in the court's discretion, the slaves could be whipped.
No. So that is death, right? So the punishment is death. The same for the Spanish, the same for the French. Same for the Spanish. Same for the French. What else? What else, ladies, when it comes to the slave laws, the similarities and differences? So under the Spanish, slaves were not to work on holy days. Holy days were days like what?
Easter Sunday.
Easter and Christmas. Very good. Let us see if there was such a rule for the Spanish. The French, I should say. So that was the Spanish. Let us look at the other one. It would be the part of it about the Christianity part of it. Or the whip. I need to look at that one. So we know for sure, it might not be because it is taken here, but let us see if they have holidays here for work. For the British. So under the British slave laws, if we look under the British slave laws, the enslaved person could work on holy days. Holy, not holies. Holy days. So days like Christmas and so. But in the Spanish, they had to work on, well, they got holidays off. And holidays mean Sunday, too. And also the French, they got holidays off. And then another one, the last one, is that were you permitted to carry guns in the British territories?
No, sir.
No weapons. When was the only exception in the British territories they could carry guns? Enslaved people.
Sir, if you were overseeing the plantation workers to see if they're doing their job.
No. When we look at the different types of production, which enslaved persons were able to carry guns?
Sir, forestry.
For the forestry, except for the forestry industry. Same thing for here. No weapon for Spanish. And no weapon for the French. So they were not allowed to bring. So ladies, so I've helped you thus far to complete the table. So you now need to come do the additional stuff. Read this, just like what we just did. Read the 3 slave laws and see the differences in it and the similarities. And you do the table just like that. So if you have your table like this now, when you're studying for your exam, this is so easy to do. All you have to do is to write it. What are the similarities? What are the differences? All right, ladies, so we meet again tomorrow at 8.
Bye, sir.
Bye-bye.